The pre-dawn hush over the Ardennes forest fractured instantly at 5:30 on a cold December morning, the 16th day of 1944. Across an immense 80-mile arc from the northern outskirts of Monschau to the southern reaches of Echternach, nearly 2,000 German artillery pieces unleashed a coordinated barrage. The earth itself seemed to heave beneath the freshly fallen snow. Trees that had stood for centuries splintered and collapsed, their wood screaming as it tore apart. American soldiers, already pressed low into frozen foxholes, felt the concussive shock waves and heard the infernal shriek of shells tearing through the air. Each explosion ripped open the darkness with a flash like hellish lightning. In every small village nestled within the wooded hills, American troops were violently roused from sleep by a thunderous, continuous roar. Windows imploded inward, showering glass, and solid stone walls buckled. Men scrambled for their rifles, their breath fogging in the bitter cold that plunged temperatures to 15 degrees below zero, their hands trembling from more than just the piercing chill. This was the final, desperate move conceived by the German High Command, an offensive codenamed Watch on the Rhine, which would later be indelibly marked in history as the Battle of the Bulge. The attacking German formations were immense, a scale of concentrated force not seen by American units since the Normandy landings half a year prior. 3 armies, comprising over 200,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks, began their advance, pushing through a swirling mixture of fog and snow. They were moving across ground that Allied military planners had routinely dismissed as unsuitable for any large-scale offensive operations. The dense, ancient forests, the deep, winding river valleys, and the narrow, twisting roads all appeared to confer an overwhelming advantage to the defender. Yet, German strategists knew this challenging terrain intimately. They had successfully navigated it before in May of 1940, when their armored columns had burst through French defenses in these very same forests, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the war. The element of surprise was complete, a total shock. American intelligence networks had utterly failed to detect the massive German buildup in the weeks leading up to the assault. Strict radio silence had been rigidly enforced across all German assembly areas. Troop movements were meticulously scheduled only under the cloak of night and beneath heavy, unbroken cloud cover, which simultaneously kept Allied reconnaissance aircraft grounded. Even crucial intercepted communications offered no warning, precisely because the Germans had relied exclusively on secure landlines instead of radio transmissions. When the attack finally struck, it landed with the force and unexpectedness of a lightning bolt from a sky believed to be clear. What those terrified American soldiers did not yet grasp, and what the advancing German divisions could not possibly have conceived, was that a crucial, hidden advantage was about to be turned against them. A technology so highly classified that its security protocols rivaled those protecting the atomic bomb itself. A weapon poised to transform ordinary artillery rounds into instruments of terror that seemed to defy the established laws of physics. German soldiers would soon discover death descending from above, delivered by explosions that burst directly over their heads, regardless of how deep they dug, no matter the thickness of the forest canopy, no matter where they attempted to find refuge. They had given it a peculiar, almost whimsical name, the funny fuse, the proximity fuse. It was about to reshape the entire character of the fight for the Ardennes. The WW2 proximity fuse was, at its heart, a complete miniature radar system, compressed into a volume no larger than a pint milk bottle. It nestled within the nose cone of a standard artillery shell, yet managed to incorporate roughly 130 electronic components. These included 5 tiny vacuum tubes, each weighing approximately 3 grams. This minuscule device possessed the capability to detect when a projectile was nearing a target and, crucially, to detonate itself at the precise, optimal moment, entirely without human intervention and without any preset timing mechanism requiring adjustment before firing. The official designation, VT, stood for variable time, a deliberately deceptive label concocted by an officer, Captain S.R. Shoemaker of the Bureau of Ordnance, specifically to obscure the true nature of this groundbreaking technology. The name merely implied a delay that could be varied, revealing nothing about the revolutionary radio technology concealed within. This strategic deception was meticulously maintained throughout the war. Even many of the artillerymen who fired shells equipped with these VT fuses had no understanding of how they actually operated. They simply observed that these special rounds consistently seemed to burst at exactly the right moment, every single time, regardless of the prevailing conditions. The core principle of its operation rested on the Doppler effect, the identical phenomenon that makes a passing police siren seem to change pitch. A single triode vacuum tube served a dual function, both as an oscillator, generating a continuous radio frequency signal around 180 to 220 MHz, and as a detector. The very body of the shell acted as the antenna, simultaneously transmitting and receiving as the projectile hurtled through the air at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. As the shell closed in on its target, whether an aircraft, the ground itself, or the dense overhead forest canopy, the reflected signal would interfere with the transmitted signal. Each half-wavelength change in distance created alternating patterns of constructive and destructive interference, producing a distinct beat frequency in the range of 200 to 800 Hz. A two-tube amplifier then filtered and boosted this faint signal. When it reached a sufficient amplitude, signaling that the target was within the lethal blast radius, a third tube discharged a firing capacitor through an electric detonator, triggering the explosion with optimal timing. The battery system within the fuse was equally innovative, representing a significant engineering breakthrough in its own right. A reserve battery, no larger than a fountain pen, contained stacked carbon and zinc plates, meticulously kept dry during storage. A sealed glass ampoule held the essential electrolyte. Upon firing, the immense setback force, equivalent to 20,000 times the force of gravity, shattered this delicate ampoule. Then, the powerful centrifugal force generated by the shell's rapid spin distributed the electrolyte across the electrode plates, generating ample power within milliseconds to activate the fuse's complex electronics. This ingenious design granted the fuse an almost indefinite shelf life, as the battery remained completely inert until the very instant of firing. Curiously, the specialized factory responsible for producing these tiny glass ampoules had, prior to the war, manufactured miniature Christmas tree light bulbs, a consumer item that became entirely unavailable to American households for the duration of the conflict. Multiple, redundant safety mechanisms were integrated to prevent any premature detonation. The battery's activation delay, a clockwork arming device meticulously triggered by centrifugal force, and a mercury safety switch that only completed the firing circuit once the shell was spinning correctly, all had to function perfectly and in precise sequence. The standard for safety was exceptionally high, no more than a single muzzle burst for every million rounds fired. This level of reliability was absolutely critical, as artillerymen had to possess absolute trust that these shells would not explode in the gun barrel or immediately after clearing the muzzle when directed against ground targets. The fuse was designed to detonate shells at an optimal height, typically between 20 and 50 feet above the surface. For 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers, this was around 30 feet. For the much larger 240 mm guns, it was 70 feet or more. In anti-aircraft applications, the maximum effective influence radius extended to about 80 feet from the target aircraft, thereby creating a significantly larger lethal kill zone than any traditional timed fuse could ever hope to achieve. The outcome of this innovation was utterly devastating. A conventional artillery shell, by contrast, explodes upon impact, dissipating most of its energy and fragments uselessly into the ground. The resulting crater could be impressive, but the lethal zone remained surprisingly confined. Soldiers had quickly learned early in the war that pressing themselves flat against the bottom of a foxhole provided excellent protection against conventional shells detonating nearby. The fragments from such explosions typically flew outward and upward, passing harmlessly over men lying prone in their dugouts. However, a proximity-fused shell, detonating 20 to 50 feet above the surface, showered its deadly fragments directly downward over an enormous area. The lethal fragment zone expanded dramatically, from roughly 60 square feet with a ground burst to approximately 3,000 square feet with an air burst. This represented a 50-fold increase in killing power. Overall lethality was estimated to have increased 5 to 10 times over traditional contact or timed fuses. A single proximity fuse shell could now accomplish what had previously demanded an entire battery, firing multiple volleys. The engineering hurdles that needed to be surmounted were simply staggering, and many experts had initially deemed them impossible to overcome. Firing a 5-inch naval gun subjected the fuse to 20,000 times the force of gravity, accelerating the shell to 2,800 feet per second almost instantaneously. This extreme acceleration occurred in a mere fraction of a second, subjecting every single component to unimaginable stress. The rifling inside the gun barrel spun the projectile at over 400 rotations per second, creating additional, powerful centrifugal forces that actively tried to tear the fuse apart. Each delicate 3-gram vacuum tube experienced a crushing force equivalent to 140 pounds. As one researcher vividly described it, imagine a grown woman standing with all her weight on a single stiletto heel, that tiny heel pressing down on a fragile glass tube. That was the immense force each component had to withstand, and it had to survive that force while simultaneously functioning as a precision electronic instrument, capable of detecting targets and initiating detonation with split-second accuracy. The creation of this weapon represented one of the most profound scientific accomplishments in the history of the United States. It was a narrative of brilliant minds racing against the clock, with the very fate of nations hanging in the balance. The story began not in America, but with the British. In 1940, researchers at the Air Defense Experimental Establishment near Portsmouth, including individuals like Winton, Edward S.H., and Amherst Thompson, drafted a confidential memorandum. It outlined the concept of a fuse that could utilize reflected radio frequency energy to detonate precisely at its closest approach to a target. The underlying idea was elegant in its simplicity, but the practical implementation presented what seemed like insurmountable difficulties. Britain, in 1940, stood on the brink of invasion. Every available resource was channeled into the immediate struggle for survival. There was simply no capacity to develop advanced weapons that might not be operational for years. The British team conducted preliminary tests against tethered balloons, achieving some limited success with prototype fuses dropped from aircraft. However, the critical challenge of designing electronics robust enough to survive the immense forces of artillery firing remained unsolved. These forces were an order of magnitude greater than anything encountered in bombs or rocket applications. British industry, already stretched to its absolute limit producing Spitfires, Hurricanes, tanks, and naval vessels, simply could not allocate the resources necessary to solve this particular intricate problem. When the Tizard mission arrived in the United States in September 1940, it carried Britain's most vital military secrets, tucked inside a single, unassuming black metal deed box. The mission was led by Sir Henry Tizard, the distinguished scientific advisor who had been a key proponent of radar development in Britain. Its explicit purpose was to share advanced British technology with the still neutral Americans, hoping to secure crucial industrial assistance and scientific collaboration. Winston Churchill had personally approved this daring mission, despite the inherent risks, calculating that America's immense industrial capacity was absolutely essential for Britain's continued survival. Among the precious contents within that deed box was the cavity magnetron, the revolutionary device that would transform radar technology and make possible the microwave systems that played a pivotal role in the Battle of the Atlantic. But also included were the detailed plans and underlying concepts for the proximity fuse, a weapon that British scientists firmly believed in, but lacked the means to construct themselves. On September 19, 1940, a physicist named John Cockcroft, who would later be awarded the Nobel Prize for splitting the atom, meticulously explained the proximity fuse design to Dr. Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution of Washington. That meeting would prove to be a watershed moment. Tuve had already been appointed chairman of Section T of the National Defense Research Committee on August 24th, charged with the broad task of developing new weapons for national defense. Now, he had found his definitive mission. He immediately grasped both the immense potential and the profound challenges inherent in the proximity fuse concept. Within days, he had completely redirected his entire team towards making it a tangible reality. Tuve was a driven, intense physicist who had pioneered the use of pulsed radio waves to measure the height of the ionosphere, foundational work that served as a precursor to radar. He had also conducted significant nuclear physics research, even building one of America's very first particle accelerators. Born in Canton, South Dakota in 1901, he held a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University and had maintained a close friendship with Ernest Lawrence, the inventor of the cyclotron, since their shared boyhood days in South Dakota. Working from the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington, alongside colleagues Richard B. Roberts, Lawrence Hafstad, and Lloyd Berkner, Tuve's team explored multiple avenues. They investigated photoelectric fuses designed to detect the shadow of a target against a bright sky. They tested acoustic fuses intended to respond to the distinctive sound of aircraft engines. They also explored various radio-based designs, experimenting with different frequencies and circuit configurations. After months of systematic experimentation and rigorous testing, they ultimately converged on radio as the most promising approach. Roberts successfully duplicated and then improved upon the initial British circuitry, constructing a self-excited radio frequency oscillator operating at approximately 70 MHz. Berkner introduced a critical improvement: separate transmitter and receiver circuits, which dramatically enhanced sensitivity and significantly reduced instances of false triggering. These crucial refinements transformed a promising, but theoretical, concept into a genuinely practical weapon system. A young physicist, James Van Allen, dedicated himself to the most formidable problem of all, designing vacuum tubes rugged enough to endure the brutal forces of being fired from a cannon. Van Allen, born in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, in 1914, would later achieve global recognition for his discovery of the radiation belts that now bear his name, becoming one of America's most celebrated space scientists. But in 1941, he spent nearly a year collaborating closely with a Massachusetts hearing aid company, striving to resolve what appeared to be an impossible engineering challenge. Starting with miniature hearing aid tubes produced by companies like Raytheon and Sylvania, Van Allen systematically tested and modified designs until he had successfully created components that could withstand forces capable of utterly crushing ordinary electronics. The delicate tubes were then embedded in specialized shock-absorbing materials, meticulously potted in wax, and further protected by being packed in oil to equalize stresses and prevent the fragile glass from breaking. Each tiny tube had to survive forces equivalent to a 140-pound weight pressing on an area smaller than a fingernail. The pace of this development was truly extraordinary by any measure. By May 1941, less than a year after the Tizard mission had delivered its secrets, bombs equipped with these prototype fuses had been successfully tested over water at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia. By September 1941, a complete shell fuse demonstrated proper function in test firings from a standard naval gun. On January 29, 1942, the first batch of production-type fuses achieved a 52% success rate when fired from a standard anti-aircraft gun. Although this figure fell short of Tuve's ambitious 80% goal, Commander William D. Parsons of the Bureau of Ordnance formally recommended that mass production commence without delay. Every day that passed without these fuses meant more American ships sunk and more American sailors lost to aggressive Japanese aircraft. The attack on Pearl Harbor had occurred just 7 weeks earlier in the Navy. desperately needed any possible advantage against the highly skilled Japanese aviators who seemed to hold dominion over the Pacific skies. In March 1942, a contract formally established the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. The laboratory initially occupied a former automobile dealership on Georgia Avenue. An unlikelier birthplace for one of the war's most critical weapons could scarcely be imagined. Tuve himself devised the name, deliberately choosing words that revealed absolutely nothing about the laboratory's true mission. His leadership style swiftly became legendary among his staff. Signs prominently displayed throughout the facility declared, "I do not want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another proclaimed, "The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late." A third emphatically stated, "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit." These were not mere empty slogans. They were guiding principles that informed every single decision made within those walls. The definitive proof of the weapon's unprecedented effectiveness arrived on August 12, 1942, in Chesapeake Bay, off the Virginia coast. The cruiser USS Cleveland conducted tests using proximity-fused ammunition against radio-controlled drone aircraft, the standard targets utilized by the Navy to evaluate anti-aircraft systems. These drones were small, swift, and notoriously difficult to hit with conventional time fuses. Gunners typically expended hundreds of rounds to destroy even a single target. The results on that day stunned every naval officer present. 3 drones were destroyed with just 4 bursts. Navy observers had simply never witnessed drones being so utterly annihilated before. The proximity fuse shells didn't just damage the targets or cause them to crash. They literally blew them apart in midair. The scheduled 2-day test was abruptly canceled after just 1 day. There was no need to continue. The evidence was conclusive. Mass production was ordered immediately. The first actual combat deployment occurred on January 5, 1943, when the cruiser USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal, utilizing 5-inch shells equipped with proximity fuses. Commander DeParsons was personally aboard to witness this historic moment. The attacking aircraft was completely destroyed by shells that detonated at precisely the correct instant, freeing the gunners from the necessity of estimating range or setting complex timing mechanisms. Over the following months, the fuse repeatedly proved its immense value in the desperate, hard-fought battles of the Solomon Islands campaign. By the close of 1943, only 25% of naval anti-aircraft shells fired carried proximity fuses. Yet these special shells accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The mathematical advantage was undeniable. A VD fuse shell was approximately 4 times more effective than a conventional time fuse shell. The proximity fuse was fundamentally altering the calculus of air defense, providing American ships with a critical edge against the highly skilled and fiercely determined Japanese aviators who had so decisively dominated the initial Pacific campaigns. Meanwhile, as winter descended in 1944, Adolf Hitler was meticulously planning his final, audacious gamble from an underground bunker far removed from the actual front lines. The Führer had watched with growing fury as Allied forces swept across France following D-Day, liberating Paris in August and pressing against the German border by September. The Wehrmacht was bleeding profusely on 2 fronts, with Soviet armies relentlessly grinding westward through Poland while Anglo-American forces pushed from the west towards the Rhine. Germany's strategic position, to most rational observers, appeared utterly hopeless. But Hitler, fueled by an unwavering delusion, absolutely refused to countenance defeat. He clung to the belief that the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was inherently unnatural and fragile, held together solely by a momentary common interest. If he could inflict a crippling blow against the Americans and the British, he reasoned, they might be compelled to seek a separate peace, thereby freeing Germany to concentrate all its dwindling strength against the Soviet threat. It was a fantasy, certainly, But Hitler had built his entire career on defying conventional wisdom and achieving what others had declared impossible. In the deepest secrecy, he ordered a massive counteroffensive to be launched through the Ardennes forest, the very same route his panzers had taken to achieve such spectacular success in May of 1940. That earlier campaign had knocked France out of the war in a mere 6 weeks and had made Hitler the undisputed master of Western Europe. He convinced himself that one more great victory, delivered through these woods, could somehow change everything again. If he could fracture the Western Allies and capture the vital supply port of Antwerp, he could effectively sever the logistical arteries supplying the British and American armies. They would be forced to negotiate. He could then pivot his remaining forces against the Soviets. The plan was audacious to the point of outright delusion. 3 German armies would smash through thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize Antwerp within 2 weeks. Hitler personally dictated every single detail of the plan, even attaching a handwritten note stating, "Not to be altered." His most senior generals harbored profound doubts. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the nominal commander of German forces in the West, privately dismissed the plan as damned foolish. General Otto von Manschufel pleaded for modifications that might offer some remote chance of success, but none dared to voice open opposition. Those who disagreed with Hitler had a disturbing tendency to disappear. The attacking force was the largest Germany could possibly still assemble. The 6th SS Panzer Army, under Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, would drive toward the northern shoulder, aiming for Liège and then Antwerp. This formation included the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, both fanatical Nazi units composed of men who held absolute belief in Hitler and National Socialism. Otto von Manschenfeld's 5th Panzer Army would strike through the center, targeting the crucial road junctions of St. Vith and Bastogne. Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army was tasked with protecting the southern flank of the advance against any potential American counterattack. Facing them stood approximately 83,000 Americans, a heterogeneous mix of green divisions, some of whom had never seen combat, and battle-weary veterans sent to what they called the Ghost Front to recuperate. The 106th Infantry Division had arrived in the Ardennes sector only 5 days before the attack, and many of its soldiers had never fired their weapons at an enemy in anger. The 28th Infantry Division was still reeling from catastrophic losses endured in the Hürtgen Forest, where it had sustained over 6,000 casualties in some of the most brutal fighting of the entire European campaign. Allied intelligence had completely failed to detect the German buildup. Strict radio silence had been rigidly enforced for weeks throughout the German assembly areas. Troop movements were executed only at night, under heavy cloud cover that kept Allied reconnaissance aircraft grounded. Even crucial ultra-intercepts, the decoded German messages that had provided such vital intelligence throughout the war, offered no warning because the Germans communicated exclusively using secure landlines rather than vulnerable radio. The stage was set for an unmitigated catastrophe, but there was still something the Germans did not know. Hidden within American ammunition dumps scattered across France and Belgium lay a substantial stockpile of artillery shells equipped with a secret proximity fuse. For nearly 2 years, this weapon had been restricted almost exclusively to naval use over water. The fear was straightforward and well-founded. If a dud shell fell on land, the Germans might recover it, meticulously reverse-engineer the sophisticated technology, and then deploy it against Allied bombers and ground troops. German scientists were among the world's finest. Given a working example, they might quickly develop their own version. The combined chiefs of staff had formally maintained this strict restriction since the fuse first entered combat in January 1943. This policy was highly controversial. Army commanders who were aware of the fuse's capabilities desperately wanted to use it against ground troops. But the Army Air Forces, under General Hap Arnold, were particularly insistent on maintaining the ban. Arnold commanded the massive bomber fleet striking Germany daily, and he greatly feared that proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells in German hands could decimate his formations. The 8th Air Force was already suffering terrible casualties over the Reich. Proximity fuses and German guns might render daylight bombing missions impossible. The fuse had only ever been used over land once before, in the defense of London against WW1 flying bombs starting in June 1944. But even then, the anti-aircraft batteries were carefully positioned along the English coast, ensuring that any dud rounds would fall harmlessly into the English Channel rather than into German-occupied territory. Every conceivable precaution was taken to prevent the secret from falling into enemy hands. The original plan had called for finally releasing the fuse for General Field Artillery service on Christmas Day, December 25, 1944. By that point, American forces were presumably expected to be so deep into Germany that any captured fuses would arrive too late to matter. But the German offensive was about to shatter that careful timetable. December 16, 1944, had begun like any other day on that quiet ghost front. American soldiers in their foxholes ate cold K rations, huddled tightly against the biting cold that had descended over the Ardennes. Forward observers peered through binoculars at the fog-shrouded German lines, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. Some men wrote letters home, meticulously choosing words that the censors would approve, expressing deep affection for families they might never see again, without being able to say so directly. Others played cards or snatched what sleep they could in the frozen earth, their bodies wrapped in every piece of clothing they possessed. In the villages behind the lines, headquarters personnel typed reports and processed the endless paperwork that modern armies invariably generate. Cooks prepared hot meals for soldiers who would soon rotate back from the front lines for a few precious hours of warmth. Chaplains held services for those who could attend, offering comfort and a fragile sense of hope amidst the profound uncertainty. No one expected anything unusual. Intelligence reports had indicated no significant German activity. The Ardennes was widely considered a quiet sector, a place to rest exhausted divisions and train new ones before reinserting them into the relentless advance toward Berlin. Then at 0530, the bombardment began and everything changed. The initial German onslaught was utterly overwhelming. It was the most brutal blow the Americans had suffered since the grim days of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia nearly 2 years prior. Units positioned all along the extended front were rapidly overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the attack. The 106th Infantry Division, still learning the treacherous terrain and settling into positions it had occupied for less than a week, was hit particularly hard. German assault troops skillfully infiltrated between its scattered positions, using the cover of dense fog and falling snow. Communications lines were severed. Units lost contact with each other and with higher headquarters. Within the first 2 days, the division's 422nd and 423rd Regiments found themselves completely encircled on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. Surrounded, without fresh supplies, their ammunition dwindling, their radios unable to reach anyone who could offer assistance, approximately 7,000 men faced an impossible choice. After desperate, failed attempts to break out, they were ultimately forced to surrender. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in United States Army history, surpassed only by the fall of Bataan and Corregidor in the Philippines in 1942. The 28th Infantry Division, already severely weakened from the brutal, grinding fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, where it had sustained over 6,000 casualties in less than 2 weeks, fought desperate, delaying actions at catastrophic cost. Its regiments were stretched dangerously thin across a front that would normally require an entire corps to defend adequately. As the German tide rolled forward, individual companies and battalions found themselves isolated, fighting alone against overwhelming odds. At Malmedy on December 17th, Waffen-SS troops of Kampfgruppe under SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper committed one of the war's most heinous atrocities. Paper's battle group served as the spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army's advance, tasked with racing ahead of the main force to seize bridges over the Meuse. When his troops captured approximately 150 American soldiers near the crossroads at Bagnes, something terrible occurred. The prisoners were herded into an open field. Then, without any warning, SS troops opened fire with machine guns. Approximately 84 unarmed American prisoners of war were murdered in cold blood. Some who survived the initial massacre by feigning death were then shot individually as SS soldiers walked among the fallen bodies. A few managed to escape the carnage and brought word of the atrocity back to American lines. News of the Malmedy massacre spread rapidly through American units throughout the Ardennes. The effect on morale was complex. Some soldiers were terrified, realizing that capture might now mean certain death. But many more were simply enraged. The massacre hardened American resolve and eliminated any inclination to give quarter to SS troops. From that point forward, many American units took few SS prisoners. The war in the Ardennes became even more brutal than it had been before. Heavily overcast skies, freezing rain, and deep snow completely grounded Allied air power for the first 9 days of the offensive. The weather, which Hitler had meticulously factored into his plan, was cooperating perfectly. American commanders pleaded for air support that simply could not materialize. Without aircraft to attack German tanks and supply columns, the ground forces were forced to confront the panzers with whatever they possessed, primarily artillery, tank destroyers, and their own sheer determination. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, the 5th Panzer Army had advanced 50 miles deep into American positions and stood within 4 miles of the Meuse River. German advance units could already discern the spires of Dinant in the distance. The audacious plan, against all expectations, seemed to be on the verge of success. One more push might just carry them to their ultimate objectives. At the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, under its acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, found itself completely surrounded by December 20th. The town controlled 7 major roads, all absolutely essential for German logistics. Whoever held Bastogne effectively controlled the entire road network of the central Ardennes. If it fell, German tanks would have an unobstructed path to the Meuse and beyond. McAuliffe commanded approximately 18,000 troops, including elements of the 10th Armored Division and the 969th Field Artillery Battalion. They were short of almost everything. Artillery ammunition was severely rationed, limited to 10 rounds per gun per day, barely enough to offer even a minimal response to constant German attacks. Food supplies were critically low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Wounded men lay in cellars throughout the town, waiting for treatment that might never arrive. The cold was relentless, and fuel for heating was almost gone. When German commanders sent emissaries under a white flag on December 22nd, demanding surrender, McAuliffe delivered his now legendary reply with a single, defiant word: nuts. The German officers, baffled by the American slang, had to ask Colonel Joseph Harper what it meant. Harper informed them it was the equivalent of telling them to go to hell. The Germans departed, and the desperate siege of Bastogne continued. But even as the situation seemed most dire, even as German tanks threatened to break through at multiple points along the dangerously extended front, a momentous decision was being made in American headquarters, far from the direct fighting. On December 16th itself, the very first day of the German offensive, a seemingly unauthorized decision by Colonel Oskar Axelson would help fundamentally alter the course of the battle. Axelson commanded the 46th Field Artillery Group, and his guns were supporting the 38th Cavalry Squadron at Monschau, directly in the path of the 6th SS Panzer Army's main effort. Wave after wave of German infantry attacked through the snow, supported by their own artillery and assault guns. Axelson's conventional ammunition was having some effect, but it was insufficient to halt the relentless assault. The Germans kept coming, literally climbing over their own dead to press the attack. He made a choice that could have easily ended his military career, a decision that brazenly violated standing orders from the highest levels of command. He ordered his batteries to load the secret proximity-fused shells, the ones marked POSIT, which he had been explicitly forbidden to use over land. Minutes later, rounds began detonating directly above the heads of the attacking German infantry. The effect was immediate and devastating. Men who had survived countless bombardments on the Eastern Front and in Normandy suddenly found themselves facing something utterly new and incomprehensible. Shells did not impact the ground and explode outward in a predictable pattern. Instead, they burst in the air directly above them, showering fragments straight down into their foxholes, their trenches, their meticulously prepared positions. There was no escape, no effective protection. The very tactics that had kept them alive through years of brutal warfare were suddenly, tragically, rendered useless. The attack collapsed. Germans who had been advancing with confidence and momentum suddenly found themselves dying by the dozens, cut down by a weapon they could not understand, and against which they possessed no defense. Forward observers directing fire that night watched in astonishment as the new shells achieved extraordinary, unprecedented results. The 196th Field Artillery Battalion was among the first units to fire these secret shells, and the effects were immediate. As more proximity fuses became available in the following days, American artillery became increasingly deadly. German commanders found that their carefully planned timetables were being thrown into chaos by unexpectedly heavy casualties. 3 days later, on December 19th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower formally requested official clearance to use proximity fuses for field artillery across the entire European theater. The German offensive had made the desperate need for such a weapon glaringly obvious. Whatever theoretical risk there might be of the Germans capturing the technology was now overwhelmingly outweighed by the dire military situation. If the Germans managed to break through to the Meuse, if Antwerp fell, the entire campaign in Western Europe might be set back by months. By December 21st, all restrictions were officially removed. The stockpiled proximity fuses flooded into the battle zone. General George S. Patton had, ironically, attended a demonstration of the proximity fuse on December 16th, the very day the German offensive began. He immediately recognized its immense potential and ordered the shells held back for a decisive moment, rather than expending them in the initial defensive fighting. When his Third Army launched its legendary counterattack to relieve Bastogne, driving north through bitter cold and tenacious enemy resistance in one of the most famous maneuvers of the war, proximity-fused artillery accompanied every step of the advance. At Echternach, Luxembourg, forward observers watched the effects of the new weapon with something bordering on awe. They reported seeing bursts with the proximity fuse 30 feet over the heads of the fleeing Germans and the murderous effects therefrom, as enemy troops attempted to cross the Sauer River on makeshift wooden bridges and fragile rubber boats. Men caught in the open had no chance of survival. Patton recorded in his diary that on the night of December 25th to 26th, 702 Germans were killed by actual count from a single battalion concentration. The number was so precise because American troops advanced over the ground the next morning and painstakingly counted the bodies. American infantrymen quickly gave the weapon a grim, sardonic nickname. They called it a Christmas present for the Germans. The devastating effectiveness of the proximity fuse at the Battle of the Bulge resulted from a lethal convergence of advanced technology and the specific terrain, a synergy that even its own designers had not fully anticipated. The densely forested Ardennes amplified the weapon's lethality in ways that transformed the Germans' chosen battlefield into a horrific killing ground from which there was no true escape. The fuse's radio transmitter, upon detecting the thick tree canopy, registered it as a reflecting surface, triggering detonation among the branches overhead. These tree bursts showered fragments directly downward, while simultaneously shattering tree trunks into secondary wooden projectiles. Splinters driven downward at lethal velocity penetrated even log-reinforced bunkers. Soldiers who had believed themselves safe beneath thick forest cover were killed by the very trees that were meant to protect them. A single shell could now clear an area that would previously have required dozens of ground impact rounds. German tactical doctrine had mistakenly calculated that persistently overcast skies and poor visibility would prevent the accurate forward observation necessary for effective timed airburst fire. Traditional airburst ammunition required observers to meticulously adjust fuse timings, watching precisely where shells burst and then radioing detailed corrections back to the gun crews. It was a slow, deliberate process that demanded clear sight lines and multiple adjusting rounds. The Germans had absolutely no concept of a self-regulating fuse that performed this complex work automatically, adjusting its burst height perfectly with every round, regardless of conditions. As a result, German divisions often moved in the open, convinced of their relative safety. They were caught in killing zones with literally nowhere to hide. High-velocity artillery shells offered no warning. The sound of the guns reached soldiers only after the shells had already burst overhead. Foxholes, the universal refuge of the infantrymen since the First World War, offered no protection whatsoever against fragments raining straight down. The mathematics of the situation were inescapable. A shell bursting 20 feet in the air distributed its lethal energy over an area 50 times larger than a ground impact. There simply was no defense against a weapon that struck from directly above. The documented reactions of German soldiers starkly illustrate the profound psychological impact of this new weapon. At Malmedy on December 21st, just 4 days after the massacre of American prisoners at that very same location, 6 American artillery battalions unleashed a barrage totaling 3,000 rounds, including proximity-fused airbursts, against Otto Skorzeny's 150th Panzer Brigade. Skorzeny was Hitler's favorite commando leader, renowned for the daring raid that had rescued Mussolini from captivity in 1943. His brigade was attempting to exploit a gap in American lines when the barrage caught them in a bare valley, with a 15-foot railway embankment on one side, offering no cover. The Germans broke completely. Some soldiers charged directly into the artillery fire, screaming Kamerad, the German word for surrender. They preferred the near certainty of death to enduring another moment under the relentless air bursts. Others threw down their weapons and fled in sheer panic. Unit cohesion disintegrated entirely. Men who had fought through years of brutal combat, who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad and Kursk and the punishing retreat across France, were reduced to terror-stricken fugitives by a weapon they could not comprehend. By December 23rd, an estimated 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused rounds in the Ardennes alone. Prisoner of war interrogations painted a consistent picture of terror and utter confusion. One German prisoner described the attacks as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. Multiple interviews documented soldiers emerging from barges in a dazed state, unable to comprehend what they had experienced or how they had possibly survived when so many comrades had died. Their extensive training had not prepared them for this. Their hard-won experience had not prepared them for this. Everything they knew about surviving artillery fire was suddenly, terrifyingly obsolete. In one documented incident, the 8th Infantry Division caught a German patrol in the Hürtgen Forest with a time-on-target mission utilizing proximity fuses. A time-on-target mission coordinates multiple batteries to have all their shells arrive at the same instant, creating a single, catastrophic explosion without any warning. There is no preliminary fire to alert the targets, no opportunity to take cover. The 96 German bodies found afterward, according to a chief ordnance officer's report, looked as if they had gone through a meat grinder. The psychological impact reached the point where German soldiers actively refused direct orders to leave their bunkers during artillery attacks. American intelligence reports describe this as minor mutiny. Veterans of the Eastern Front and the Normandy hedgerows, hardened soldiers who had never before broken under fire, now cowered in their positions rather than face the inexplicable death that rained from above. When ordered to advance, they simply refused, preferring military justice to what they perceived as certain death. German commanders desperately sought to understand the nature of what they were facing. They offered bounties for soldiers who could recover an intact fuse. They relentlessly interrogated prisoners, hoping to glean some information about the mysterious weapon. Yet, Even when they overran an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses, German engineers failed completely to recognize the significance of what they had captured. The shells visually resembled ordinary artillery rounds. The crucial significance of the posit marking was not understood. This failure of recognition reveals something profound about the proximity fuse's ultimate impact. Germany had, in fact, spent years researching proximity fuses, exploring more than 30 different designs. Their engineers had meticulously examined every conceivable approach, optical, acoustic, magnetic, and radio, and had ultimately concluded that the concept was impossible for artillery shells. The acceleration forces were simply too extreme. No vacuum tube, they reasoned, could possibly survive being fired from a cannon. No battery could withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity. German science had definitively determined that this particular innovation simply could not be done. So, when their own soldiers were being slaughtered by this very technology, German technical experts literally could not comprehend what they were confronting. It was as if their enemy had deployed a weapon that violated the very laws of physics as the Germans understood them. They were utterly unable to develop countermeasures for something they firmly believed did not, and could not, exist. This profound failure of imagination, rooted ironically in the very thoroughness and rigor of German research, cost thousands of German soldiers their lives. The Battle of the Bulge raged until January 25, 1945. The German offensive, which had begun with such overwhelming force and initial promise, ultimately failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. The Meuse River was never crossed. Antwerp remained firmly in Allied hands. The hope for split between British and American forces never materialized. Bastogne was finally relieved on December 26th, when elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement. Instead of forcing a negotiated peace, the offensive utterly exhausted Germany's last strategic reserves of men, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. American casualties were severe, with approximately 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. It was the bloodiest battle American forces fought in the European theater. But German losses were catastrophic. Between 80,000 and 100,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 800 tanks and assault guns were destroyed. These were losses that Germany, in the final, desperate months of the war, could never hope to replace. The Eastern Front still demanded everything Germany could produce. The Battle of the Bulge, far from saving Germany, instead accelerated its inevitable collapse. Approximately 200,000 proximity fuse shells were used during the Battle of the Bulge. While it would be an oversimplification to credit the fuse alone for the Allied victory, its contribution was unquestionably significant and widely acknowledged by all who witnessed its effects. General Patton wrote to Major General Levin Campbell, Chief of Army Ordnance, with an assessment that would become famous. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating," he wrote. "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." He also stated flatly that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. James Finney Baxter III, the Pulitzer Prize-winning official historian of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, placed the proximity fuse among the 3 or 4 most extraordinary scientific achievements of the war. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory reaffirms this ranking in its institutional history. Alongside the atomic bomb and radar, the proximity fuse stands as one of the 3 most valuable technological developments of World War II. The comparison is instructive. The atomic bomb was used twice. Radar was primarily a detection and warning tool. The proximity fuse, however, was fired more than 22 million times and directly multiplied the killing power of every gun that used it against ground troops in the Ardennes. It increased artillery lethality 5-fold to 10-fold. December 16, 1944, at 0530 hours. A cold, dark morning when the factory that